Welcome to Penn State Dickinson Law's Profiles in Leadership series. My name is Darrell Lim. I serve as the H. Leddy Montag Professor of Law and Associate Dean for Research and Innovation at the Law School. This series offers an unparalleled opportunity to glean insights from top leaders in the law who serve in government, education, the private sector, and civil society, and those who serve outside of the law as well on important areas. In this episode, we invite these leaders to reflect on their journey and share skills, core values, and qualities that make them the leaders they are today. We're very pleased to have Stephanie Couch, Executive Director of the Lemelson-MIT Program. In this role, she leads a team which helps educators and students across the US learn ways inventors find and solve important problems. She has dedicated her career K-12 and higher education policy issues and actively participates in the National Invention Education Research Group. Her research as an ethnographer in education focuses on issues that are key to advancing equity within the field of invention education and STEM learning opportunities. She studies ways invention education impacts students, especially those from underrepresented backgrounds, schools, and local communities. She also works to understand the developmental trajectories of inventors as opposed to their inventions. Locally, she is spearheading a consortium in Cambridge, Massachusetts that will operate a new 50,000 square foot community center for STEM and the arts. Welcome, Stephanie.
Thank you so much. Glad to be a part of this.
We are so pleased to have you. Let's start with your UC years. Important to understand a bit of your background and where you came from, and we'll talk about trajectories afterwards. So share a little bit about your trajectory, talk about your years at Davis and Santa Barbara.
Sure. So I grew up in the Central Valley of California in a small town. We were really in the center of the agricultural part of California. And I went to Modesto Junior College thinking I wanted to be a teacher or work in child development. And along the way, I took a political science course and fell in love with policy and also international relations. So I was kind of mixed up. I couldn't quite pick an area because I had so many interests and loves. And then I went to UC Davis and decided that I would go ahead and pursue a political science degree. And in the last year, I was able to do an internship in the state capitol and just absolutely fell in love with policymaking and being able to make a difference in the world through legislation. And so when I graduated, I was fortunate enough to get a job based on the internship I'd had in the state capitol, get a job in a lobbying firm. And they operated much like a law firm with multiple clients, but all of the firm's clients somehow had an interest in education. So it was really interesting because now all the things I'd wanted to do came together in one job. And so anyway, I ended up, after years as a lobbyist, many years as a lobbyist, having my own firm, going back into the state capitol for a bit to advise the Senate Appropriations Committee and then 2 assembly speakers, and then ended up leaving to go to work with the UC Office of the President. And along came an initiative right as the internet was coming into being, and it was to bring fiber networks to all of the education community, K-12, our community colleges, our state colleges, our universities would be all part of one big network. And the job I was asked to do was to help policymakers understand the importance of investing in that for education, and to also develop new initiatives that would take advantage of the bandwidth. This was before we all used the internet. We were still shipping things around on CD-ROMs. And So anyway, I was fascinated when I started seeing some of the new forms of teaching and learning with technology, but I didn't have a way of capturing the value because you couldn't measure it on a standardized test. And that's when I came to understand ethnography as a way of looking at what is happening with inventions and innovations. And I needed to apply that lens that often gets applied by the corporate sector in product development or in drug therapy development. I needed to apply that to this innovation in education. And I fell in love with ethnography, and that got me back to UC Santa Barbara. And fortunately, I was able to go to school while I was also continuing to work. So those were the UC years. I'm very, very grateful to both campuses for all the ways in which they let me grow, and couldn't be more bullish on a higher education and all the opportunities it unleashes.
Thanks, Stephanie. Quick follow-up question. When you worked with folks in politics, how do you think that informed the skill set or the way that you approach your subsequent careers and if you like, the challenges that you might face professionally?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when I first entered the lobbying world, your job as a lobbyist is to help your clients achieve their goals and what they need to have happen. And, I've always been kind of a middle of the road person. And so what I started doing for my clients was looking at which legislators are very active in terms of sponsoring bills in the area that my client cares about. And then I would take all the pieces of legislation from the different legislators and look at the code sections that were being changed in their bills. And then I would analyze where members lined up and what they wanted to have happen, each member. And by doing that, I was able to see what Democrats cared about, what Republicans cared about, and figure out how, if I put the right bills together, I could get bipartisan support from people of both parties and therefore capture the votes that I needed to get something passed. And I realize now, in retrospect, that is a type of practice that is done by an ethnographer. And so, I didn't even know it back then, but I was doing a form of discourse analysis, which is one of the approaches we use in ethnography.
Interesting. Did you figure all this out by yourself, or did you have a mentor?
Well, I have had the good fortune of having several good mentors in my life. Mentoring is just so important. So I had a wonderful mentor during my internship. His name is David Takashima, and he is back again in the legislature now, working for a member as his chief of staff. And we've recently reconnected, so I'm loving that. But he basically helped me learn how to function in the policy world and how to investigate problems and how to collaborate with other people to come up with build proposals, build the coalitions needed to support an idea, develop understandings, just a really important mentor. And I had always thought I had to go to law school when I went down the political science path, and he had gone to law school, and he was one of the ones that said, you don't have to go to law school in order to be involved in the policy world. You should go because you're going to use it. And so anyway, he was very influential in all those ways. And then when I went into the job about bringing the internet connectivity and new forms of teaching and learning out across our whole state. You know, think about it. We have over 6,000 K-12 schools, over 6 million K-12 students. I mean, it was a massive job. And I did not have a background in technology. So there again, I had a wonderful mentor, Sherilyn Shitsu Evans, who she and I would go side by side into every meeting. And she would talk about the technology. I would do the other parts about education policy. And then after about 3 or 4 years of being joined at the hip, I learned enough of what Sherilyn would say and what was in her brain to be able to go out alone. So again, you know, another mentor. And I think every step in my career, there are important mentors. On the ethnography side, it was Professor Judith Green, who has since retired from UC Santa Barbara. But we first met up when I was trying to understand these innovations, and she and another colleague, Beth Yeager from UC Santa Barbara, helped with documenting and assessing and researching numerous innovations before I ultimately went to grad school.
Thank you. Just as a quick segue to my next question about STEM education. When we cross paths, a lot of the people that we meet are either lawyers or people that are deeply involved in the technology sector, or quite likely both. And you stand apart from them in the sense that you are neither a lawyer, nor are you necessarily a technologist per se. And that's a wonderful breath of fresh air. But from your perspective, how does it look like being in that room with all these lawyers and technologists who are speaking gobbledygook a lot of the time?
Yes. So each of these environments, whether it's the legislative policymaking world or the technology world, they all have their own acronyms. And so, you know, in the legislature, our bill proposals were often critiqued by what is called the legislative analyst, who would give independent advice to members about whether they should support something or what its fiscal costs would be. And then you also have the Department of Finance, who also serves that function on the fiscal side. And so there's a lot of look at not just the implications of what a change to law or budget item could do for people, but also the fiscal parameters and whether it's efficient and effective. And so then I went into the technology world, and they're throwing out a lot of terms I had to come to know, like a wave on a network. You know, if you're not a technology person, what's a wave on a network? Another term was we're going to build in redundancy. Now, coming from the legislative background, the last thing in the world you want is redundancy, right? That means you're wasting money. So every job I go into does have its own terminology. And in both of those worlds, certainly the policymaking world has changed. But when I went in, there weren't many female lobbyists, and there weren't many female legislators. That has changed. But when I went into the technology environment and some of these leaders in advanced networking, there were very, very few women. I'm hoping that's changing as well, but I don't believe it's changing as fast as the legislative and policymaking environment. But it is intimidating, but I just, you know, am not afraid to walk into new things, because when you are an ethnographer, ethnography comes out of sociology, anthropology. It was used, you know, in the beginning by someone going into another land, right, and coming to understand the people and to report that back. Their ways of thinking, knowing, being, doing. And so I just arm myself with those skills to walk into a new place and say, what's happening here? Who is able to do what, with whom, for what purposes, under what conditions? You know, I start that whole litany of questions that ethnographers ask. And So really that becomes my way of being in worlds that I don't quite fit. And that's a tremendous advantage because I can notice things and I can ask questions that sometimes are very important because people have gotten so used to their way of doing things, they haven't stopped to reflect why they're doing them or what they mean or what the impact can be. So I think it's really important. I hope this answer is not too long, but one
No,
of the
that's very
things,
helpful. I think
yeah,
you've
go
just
ahead.
inspired me, and I hope you inspire our listeners too, to find our inner ethnographers, because that sounds like such a critical skill to be able to learn how to learn and to be able to adapt to different environments, which both of which are hallmarks of leadership.
I do believe that developing what I call ethnographic eyes is crucial for any leader, because it's really all about coming to understand human conditions and perspectives from the perspective of someone else. Understanding your team who work with you, being able to understand the culture that has developed in the organization you've been asked to lead, and knowing then how you can go about shifting that culture if necessary. Those are all really important parts of leadership.
Great insights. Let's talk about STEM now. So you were at the California STEM Learning Network, Institute for STEM Education, and then you were also director for Gateway East Bay STEM Network. So STEM, STEM, STEM. Talk to us about how you got into it and your transition between the various roles.
Yes, so in the work with trying to bring the networking and technology into teaching and learning in education, it was a real uphill battle because, you know, schools are used to teaching science as its own discipline, English as its own discipline, and now to integrate technology into those forms of teaching was really hard. And then along came a very organized effort in multiple states, sort of instigated by the National Governors Association, and then the Gates Foundation, Battelle, the Bechtel Foundation. They joined together to start a movement in 10 different states to statewide have integrated STEM programming. And, you know, the expertise that it takes in order to come to understand all of those things, to integrate them into learning opportunities for young people. It takes a lot of people being at the table, working together collaboratively. And teachers don't always have everything they need to know. It really is something that can only happen if really a lot of different stakeholders work together, both from the private sector, from corporations, where these different disciplines get, you know, used in the workplace. They get integrated in the workplace. Nobody separates them out when you address a real problem or a real challenge or try to build something in the workplace. And so we needed networks of people to come together. And I quickly also learned that, you know, we don't learn technology or how to integrate the different disciplines overnight in a class. This is something where you have to have practice all the way from your early years, all the way through schooling. And when you're young, before you enter kindergarten, you're just learning everything together. We don't separate it out into English, math, science. And so really what we had to end up doing to integrate STEM, it's really applying disciplinary knowledge to real world scenarios, real world, not just made up in a book. And so to make those learning opportunities available to all kids and bridge these divides as to who was having those opportunities or not, we had to form ecosystems and get collaborative work going from museums and libraries and the corporate sector, foundations, and we all had to look at what assets existed in the community, what was missing that would allow all kids to be successful in learning STEM and applying STEM in their daily lives. And then together we had to prioritize what to do year 1, year 2, year 3 in order to begin to make change at the community level. And all of that really stemmed from a desire to bridge gaps. And by gaps, I mean, you look at gender gaps and who is and is not learning and participating in the STEM field and STEM ecosystems, gaps based on race and ethnicity, gaps based on income. When you look over and over again, these are gaps that exist because we have not embedded first technology education. Now I came to understand STEM education. We've not embedded those learning opportunities across grade spans. So that's the path I've been on.
Now, how did you get on that path? How did that ethnographer find her calling in STEM education?
Yes, so in California was one of those 10 states that the Gates, Bechtel, and Battelle foundations were working with. And the effort in California was being led by a small group, including Susan Hackwood of the California Council on Science and Technology, and then also the former president of Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. And fortunately, I was one of the ones that they interviewed to lead that, and I had the privilege of being able to get California's strategic plan developed and off the ground. And then right about that time, Cal State East Bay was also launching a brand new institute for STEM education. They raised some funds from the Bear Foundation and from Wareham Development for the institute, and they had some funding that they started a regional STEM network. And I just, all my work had been in the legislature or statewide, had been very high level. And I was so itching after developing our STEM plan that involved regional networks and working regionally as well as statewide. It was sort of a 2-layered network concept. I was so eager to get in my hands dirty by being on the ground, working with teachers, working with principals and superintendents, and that it was just wonderful to get a chance to go work the regional STEM network as well as work at a college campus and work to integrate our College of Education with our College of Science that included engineering, and then our humanities and our business as well, and just try to see how you begin to bring faculty together to work in a interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary way.
Thank you. So we're going to talk in a few minutes about Lemelson-MIT. But before that, you had a number of different positions. And at each position, it's a little bit like a fork in the road. You decided to stay the course and you wanted to continue with STEM education. Other people have careers that go in all sorts of different directions. So it wasn't a given that you would necessarily follow the same path. I think it would be helpful for our listeners to understand how you processed your decision-making, and each step you say, this is the path I want to continue on, this is the path I want to go on, this is the place I want to be, rather than somewhere else. So please talk a little bit about that.
Yes, so again, in the policymaking world, it was wonderful to be able to try to craft great policy, but I had never worked deeply at the ground level. And so I had to take people's word for what was right. So I did my homework. I listened to education researchers and all of that to try to make sure that the policy I was advocating for was the best policy, but I hadn't actually been on the ground to know for sure. And so this move away to work on advocacy with the UC system, and then to work on getting technology integrated across the whole state. For me, that was more, my personal passion of believing that education's important and getting the higher ed path for young people, like in the Central Valley where I grew up, promoting that access to educational opportunity. That was a values choice. It still didn't get me closer to the ground until I started working then on getting the networks out and built and the new forms of teaching and learning. Then I was much more closer to the ground, and I was working hand in hand with the ethnographers from UC Santa Barbara. So that was very rewarding. That was a fulfilling choice to really specialize in that. And then with the STEM education, the ability to work with different communities across California as they crafted their plans and looked at what was not happening in education, what needed to be happening, and help them figure out how we could advance together and solve some of these equity issues and social justice, which is a theme that runs across here. That was rewarding. But the integrated STEM got me closer to, I think, with all the careers being increasingly technological, without that form of teaching and learning, there are many young people who are still going to be stuck in low-wage jobs, who are not going to have the opportunity to advance. And so integrated STEM took me one step closer, but I could still see how we were having trouble convincing girls, low-income students, students who are Black, Latinx, people of color, even with making the learning opportunity available, it still wasn't resonating as much as it could with them to take advantage of that learning opportunity. So it was one step closer to solving a big problem in my mind, but it wasn't the final solution because there wasn't enough take up from their end. And so then the next step is where I got invited to come and take a look at what the Lemelson-MIT program was doing. And I was fascinated that with their high school grants initiative that was national in scope, they were able to take teams of high school students who were not the AP kids, they were the kids I cared about, and within a 1-year period, able to help the students and teachers develop the capacity to create a prototype of an invention, with some earning patents for their work. And I could see in the materials the excitement of the students and how into this work the students were. And so I felt like there was some secret sauce there that was a missing component in what we've been able to do in the STEM education movement. And so I really was curious to come and bring my ethnographic capabilities and lens and try to discover what the secret sauce was that LMIT had.
And if you took a step back now, having served there for a number of years at the organization, what it's become, what would you say are the defining traits that's pointing to Stephanie Crouch's ethnographic background, or your life trajectory, if you like?
Yeah, so, I learned through all these experiences, we all are smart, right? My advisor often asked, how are you smart? And similarly with the community work, there are assets everywhere. There are problems everywhere that need good solutions, but there are assets in every community as well. So I think the most important thing I've learned through all of these and try to take with me in the work I do is to walk into any situation and to approach it from a strengths-based lens. So when we bring young people together to work on an invention project, they have to first discover what are the strengths that they are bringing to their work. What are the problems that they're intending to solve? What are they passionate about doing, and work from a position of passion? And then look at what are all the assets in the community that they can tap in order to come to understand that problem deeply, and also to inform their thinking about the design of a solution. Similarly, when they have an idea or a prototype they want to bring forward, it's okay, what are all the assets in your network that you can tap into that help you bring your invention or your prototype forward? So I would say the common thread across all of this is to get rid of deficit thinking and to approach everything from inquiry, open-ended inquiry, and from a strengths-based, some say growth mindset.
Thank you. So you are the top of the pyramid at the Lemelson-MIT program. You run a staff with that I had the privilege of meeting. And a lot goes on. You guys are doing just fantastic work. How do you get a handle on what everybody is doing, and how do you bring it together into a coherent, focused whole?
Yes. So we have spent a lot of time trying to understand from the perspective of prolific inventors and collegiate inventors and our high school inventors who've managed to protect their intellectual property or built a prototype. What are those things that have contributed to your capacity as an inventor and an innovator? So we've really done a lot to research the developmental trajectory of someone who invents as opposed to their invention. Like, their invention's nice and it's important, but how do we make more inventors? And so one of the things we've discovered really is that process that I mentioned earlier about stepping out to find a good problem to solve in your community that you and a team, because invention's team-based, are passionate about, step out into that, and then, work through this process of designing a solution, building your prototype, reassessing it with your audience, and then ultimately bringing it forward. That process is something that we can begin really early, way down at kindergarten. And prolific inventors have had somebody in their life that has been asking questions, noticing, pointing things out, nurturing that development. We talked about mentorship earlier. It's often multiple mentors who are playing those kinds of roles. And so in our offerings, what we try to do, the staff team and collaborators, is develop great instructional resources that can help educators take young people through that cycle as early as kindergarten and repeatedly across ages and grade spans. Obviously getting a little bit more and more advanced as you get older. So all of what we do has to fit that. And that's the number one question we ask. And then the second question is, it's very much our approach is a facilitation. And so every resource we put together is to support teachers in facilitating learning. The student still has to be out learning how to ask the good questions, how to find the knowledge they need, how to acquire the skills. It's not a model where we pour things into the head. So really, I hire great people. We spend a lot of time collaborating on the designs of resources or instructional approaches, and then it's out finding the resources we need so we can work hand in glove with as many educators in school and out of school as possible, and support communities in building these pathways for young people.
Thank you. We talked early on in the conversation about the impact that mentors have had on you in your life. What does mentoring look like to you? And if you can talk about one or two examples of how you have paid it forward in terms of mentoring folks, but I think our listeners would be interested to hear.
Yeah, so anyone who comes into my world, they're now a part of my family. And I'm going to several people come to mind. The first thing I would say that usually in an institution, your bosses want to focus on retention. And so you want to do things that keep your employees here. You don't want to go through them. I guess I've always approached as a manager, I want to understand where my employees want to go with their life. And I want to make sure that the opportunities they're getting in their work world are taking them in the path they want to go in as well. So it may not be 100%, but I want to give them the opportunities. If they need additional professional development or education, I want to provide for that. So for me, that's a form of mentoring in how I manage my team. But one individual comes to mind when I got here at the Lemelson-MIT Program. He was an intern, and I had the privilege of working with him. And he just recently sent me a picture of when he left us, a note I wrote to him in his notebook. And we've stayed in touch. He had a desire to possibly start a nonprofit to help young people like him who were growing up in low-income homes. Believe it or not, we still have that in Cambridge. People, often don't realize it's right next door to us. So I work deeply in my community, and he knew that. And so we would meet occasionally to talk about what he could be doing in a nonprofit stance. And then stayed in touch a little bit during the COVID years. And then he came back into my life recently and was finishing up his dissertation work at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. He's now becoming a assistant professor of sociology. And he is hired now by Sacramento State University, back where I spent so many years in Sacramento, in the state capital of California. And so he came back in the spring to be one of our instructors as we ran in the community one of our quick invention workshops. And so he got to learn how much we've changed our curriculum since he was with us as an intern, and got to see what the impact of that good work was on the students that we served. And then I have a program where we're now teaching MIT students ethnography. We do a rapid 2-week course for undergraduates. It's an internship. And then after those 2 weeks, they actually are participant observers in one of our program offerings. And then the last 2 weeks are writing up their study. And so he came onto our team to be one of the instructors in that program this summer. So now he's seen the invention education offering. He's been part of the ways we're researching our own offerings. And now he'll go to Sac State, and I certainly hope he will continue to be a big part of our world as he goes into his next phase. So that's an example of the kind of mentoring I like to do.
An amazing example of how things can come a full circle.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But we're going to switch gears in just a moment to talk about your other spearheading leadership initiative with the community center. But is there anything else you want our viewers to know about the Lemelson-MIT program?
I guess, the one thing that I would say is that this form of education where you get to apply what you learn in all the different disciplines to real problems, facing real people, to design a real solution, to me is hugely important. And it's very different than the way we've structured schools and colleges and universities to serve the students. There are lots of complications, lots of policy issues. So if there are any of your listeners who are into education policy and education law, there is a lot to work on to make this a reality for every student. So I'm happy to talk to anybody who is interested in specializing in school finance or education policy.
Wonderful. Is there a contact person at your organization that they can get in touch with? If so, we can put that information in the description link to this video.
Oh, well, they can contact me directly.
Okay.
Yes.
Make a note of it. Wonderful. So let's talk about the community center. STEM and the arts. It almost sounds like a Renaissance idea, something that Leonardo da Vinci might have come up with. Tell us about that.
Yes. So when I got here, again, I didn't know much about inventing. And so one of the things that I did was take a trip to DC to the Smithsonian, because there is a Lemelson Center at the one of the Smithsonian's. And there was an exhibit, and it showed innovation in different parts of the United States and how it come about. And more often than not, there were stories about these chance encounters of people, somebody had deep knowledge of a problem and they ran across somebody who had a technical skill, and together they were able to create an invention. And so it just got me thinking about, if I want to promote invention and innovation in my local community, I need a place where people are going to have those chance happenings. People who have different skill sets are going to meet each other and get to talking. And but for this chance encounter, something would have never happened. Now, I actually think it takes a little bit more intentional weaving than that, but you first need a place where it can happen. And then also, we've been trying to work in our local community to build the pathways, the learning opportunities for young people as early as kindergarten all the way up, so that someday they could perhaps have their own invention in our incubator and accelerator. We have a place called the Engine for really hard to solve problems, inventions that are going to take a little longer to mature. They're not quick wins financially. So we wanted to be STEAM for the engine, but we had to have a place where we could offer those. So this new Center for STEM and the Arts provided the opportunity to have a space for all those things. But this is a building that is in 1890 produced steam pumps. And the city had been given this dilapidated building as part of a development agreement. So they and the Cambridge Redevelopment Authority had put money in to fix the building and make it beautiful, but it needed somebody to run it. And we needed space for these kinds of wonderful programs. We think of doing our work locally as our living lab. So when we work with educators across the US, we're not experimenting, we know it works. And so we worked with other organizations in the community to put a coalition together to win the rights to operate. And then we incubated that as a separate nonprofit. And now I serve as president of the board, but it's really its own organization stewarding this community asset. And of course, the Lemelson-MIT program uses it.
And it's a wonderful space. I recommend to all our listeners, if you are ever in the area, drop by, and I think you'll be inspired by what you see.
It's amazing. One day I was there again when we were running one of our programs, and we were working with the students in the room that has all the 3D printers. And I noticed this guy, and he had this beautiful picture on his laptop, and I looked over, and the 3D printer was printing this image on jean fabric. I said, oh my gosh, that's just absolutely gorgeous. What are you going to do with it? And I had not noticed he had a pair of pants on the table. He said, I'm going to sew that into my pants. Oh my gosh, because there's a sewing room next door to the 3D printing room. I thought that is just really awesome. He must be an artist. I said, are you an artist? And he said, well, no, not really. I said, well, what do you do for your day job? And he says, oh, I 3D print bio parts. Like, okay. So this shows how STEM and the arts really do go together.
Yes, it does.
And
It
so that
does.
was one of those chance happenings I'd hoped for, and we had him speak to our young inventors.
Wonderful. And do you see this proliferating across the country, more such community centers where we bring the STEM and the arts together?
Yes, I think that having these kinds of spaces is incredibly important. Again, going back to bridging the divides that exist in our communities, a lot of times educators will say to me, well, isn't it okay if our students just do a social innovation? And of course it is. Nothing's wrong with social innovation. But what I see in terms of a divide when it gets to employment and earning a living is that many of the young students have never had the chance to develop the technological or STEM skills. So they really don't have the opportunity to get those jobs. They don't have a choice about it. They haven't developed the skill sets. And so, one of the reasons I love STEM and inventing is because it provides for those hands-on learning opportunities and the technology skill development. But unfortunately, where are you going to actually do the building of a physical prototype of an invention or anything? Where's that going to happen? Because a lot of schools don't have maker spaces or the right tools and equipment. Now we improvise, we have workarounds for that, but community centers like this are far better, where there's a go-to place and where there's people who understand the skills and can show others how to use tools, how to work with technology. So to me, it's essential for innovation. I know NSF, the National Science Foundation, is providing grants for engines of innovation. They want innovation hubs to spread. And if we're going to spread innovation, we have to have these kinds of spaces for co-teaching and co-learning.
Can you talk a little bit about the importance of partnerships and coalitions? You talk about the National Academy of Inventors. We have the US IP Alliance. We've got Invent Together. How do you work with partners to find synergies with what you do?
Yes. So I guess, from way back, from my beginning days as a lobbyist, I realized that oftentimes we educators, don't have as strong a voices as we need. And so we must collaborate with other organizations who have more voice or stronger voices, and we need to add up organizations so together we have really loud voices. And from my perspective, the US is sort of falling behind when it comes to invention and innovation, and part of that is because we're not teaching these ways of thinking and being and doing for young people in the K-12 years. We've also left community college students out of the equation. And so I'm really about demystifying not only this process of how you learn to create something that will have value, but also how you protect that intellectual property so that you can get the investment you need to help you get the investment you need and to be able to bring your ideas and creations forward. And again, we don't teach that in our public school systems. We don't demystify it. Therefore, I believe the reasons we see deep divides in who is taking advantage of patents and trademarks and copyrights is all about that it hasn't been demystified. So the only way to change all of that, to change education, is for these partnerships and alliances to get built between groups like the US IPA, the National Academy of Inventors, Invent Together. We must unify. We must put our logos together. We must speak with one voice about the importance of invention and intellectual property education.
Thank you. We're running out of time, so just two more questions. One, I think it's important to highlight the prominence that your work has enjoyed, because you had a visitor from overseas. The head of the Korean patent office actually made it a point while she was here to visit you and your colleagues at Lemelson-MIT. And you also shared with me how you learned their initiatives, what they are doing in Korea in having women in patenting. So talk a bit about that, and then also talk a little bit about what's next for Stephanie Couch.
Thank
in
you.
2023 yes. And beyond.
So the Republic of Korea is really interesting. They do have a national curriculum, and they have put IP, intellectual property education, as a part of their curriculum. They also have opportunities within the high schools for students to work as inventors. And they've made a real investment in professional development hubs for educators. And, you know, as a result, when we look at the divides that exist in, you know, here in the US, like the gender divides, for example, and then you look to the Republic of Korea, they are women are far more represented in patenting. And I think that is a function of what we've been saying, that the learning opportunities are there as a part of the formal education process. I really hope that we're able to make that happen here in the United States. And I guess what's next for me, you know, whatever I do, I'm going to continue to keep working on trying to bring invention education and education about intellectual property into the regular school day so that it can reach all students. This shouldn't be some chance after school program. All kids need this as part of their educational learning opportunities. And I do see the work that we're doing now with our Student Fellows Program, teaching ethnography and ways of learning what's happening and studying situations through the ethnographic lens. I see that as an important part, being glue for all of this, because, you know, I am, as you said, I'm not a STEM person, but I know these ways of going into any scenario and coming to understand the needs and perspective as humans deeply, and to look at what they might do or not do with some sort of an invention or creation. You know, I now see that I belong as part of these teams, because inventing is a team sport, because I bring something important to a part of that process. Even though I'm not the technology person, I'm an important part of an invention innovation team. So, you know, all of a sudden I see where every discipline has something to give in that process. And that is why I so appreciate the National Science Foundation's work around convergence and the recent recommendations that STEM education work from a transdisciplinary perspective that just came out, and recognized Invention Ed as a promising practice for that. So somehow I'm going to keep making progress on these things.
And long may that progress endure. Stephanie, as we bring the interview to a close, I want to thank you for all that you do for the arts and STEM, for K-12 education, for your leadership with the coalitions and alliances that you're part of, and for inspiring all of us to think a little bit harder about how we can bring out our inner ethnographers.
Thank you so much. And I so appreciate my work with you and your leadership with the U.S. Intellectual Property Alliance. I know you co-chair our higher education committee, but you do so much more than that. And I'm very grateful to you. Thank you.
Thank you.